6 of Daniel, because I'm not missing out chapters 4 and 5. We're going to be doing those next week. But 3 and 6 are actually the most famous chapters in the book of Daniel, and they do both have a very similar story to tell, although the characters are different in either case. The two most well-known stories, the rescue of the 3 friends of Daniel from the fiery furnace, and the rescue of Daniel from the lion's den. And if ever you hear anybody mention Daniel, everybody thinks, oh, the lion's den, and we think we know that story so well, which we probably will. But we're going to read both stories in full this afternoon. And they tell the same truth, and that is that the Lord can deliver his people from the pagan and hostile enemies that pose a threat to them. But there is, however, a great caveat. In chapter 3 and verse 18, which we will read in a moment, but just let me read this first. The caveat is, "But even if God does not deliver us, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." So it's a matter of whatever happens, God is on the throne, and he is God and there is no other.
King Nebuchadnezzar had a gold statue made 27 metres high and nearly 3 metres wide, and he had it set up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then the king gave orders for all his officials to come together, the princes, the governors, the lieutenant governors, commissioners, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all other officials of the provinces. They were to attend the dedication of the statue which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. When all these officials gathered for the dedication and stood in front of the statue, a herald announced in a loud voice, "People of all nations, races and languages, you will hear the sound of the trumpets, followed by the playing of oboes, lyres, zithers and harps, and then all the other instruments will join in. As soon as the music starts, you are to bow down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Anyone who does not bow down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace."
Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must bow down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up."
Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And these three men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace.
Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisers, "Weren't there three men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see four men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors and royal advisers crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them.
Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
Thank you. Well, if that's not a story told with hyperbole, I don't know what is. I mean, there are parts of it that really want to make me laugh out loud. I don't know about you. We can be so pious about the Bible and read it in a stentorian voice, but actually I think this story is really made to make us smile and think, yeah, good on God's people, ha ha. They had the last laugh, did they not? Well, it's a simple story and it's simply told. Interestingly, Daniel, who is the hero of this book, is not mentioned at all, but only the three friends of his that we met in the first chapter, they are the protagonists in this story, and this is the only other mention of them in the book. We don't hear about Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego ever again. But I think the point of that is that God's power is at work for all his faithful people. And these stories, as we noticed last time, were written down largely to encourage later generations of God's people who were suffering persecution, because this period in Old Testament history was the beginning of a very sustained period of different empires coming to the forefront and doing great atrocities against the children of Israel and against other nations as well. But of course it's the story of the Jews that have been recorded for us, and so we see how persecuted and maligned they were, which of course has been the story of the Jewish race all through the centuries, sadly, and is no worse today than ever it has been. But the main aim of the story really is to show that the worship of God, the living God, became permissible even at a time when idolatry was threatening to take over. Nebuchadnezzar had come out of the previous story, that of his dream and Daniel interpreting it and so on. He'd come out of the previous story saying, oh, you know, surely your God is a God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. And he praises Daniel and he praises his God. But all of a sudden, we are shown that praise and that adulation was completely false and completely hollow, because at the beginning of this chapter, right at the end of the last account, Nebuchadnezzar's making this great statue and saying, oh, you know, this is me and you've got to bow down and worship and so on and so forth. And it was reinforced his edict was reinforced by this ridiculous list of all these governors and satraps and advisors and prefects and goodness knows who else. And then the list of the musicians, the flutes and the lyres and the harps. Every time you hear these, you ought to bow down and worship. It's a totally ridiculous scenario, but it shows how powerful and how really unreliable King Nebuchadnezzar is. And that he can be advised very badly by these people who are really just having an eye to the main chance and what promotion in the court. So although he'd acknowledged God as all-powerful, like all tyrants, he had a will of his own, and he's soon back to his own vain old tricks again. And paying lip service to God is of no meaning or value whatsoever. A conversion of the heart is what is necessary, and we are all aware of that. Of course, God looks not on the outward appearance, but he looks upon the heart. And it's true for us. That uprightness of heart is shown by the three faithful Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, of whom the wise men of Babylon are obviously agonizingly jealous. This is what this is all about. They are jealous that these people seem to keep coming out on top, and the king, after all sorts of trials and tribulations, seemed to keep wanting to promote them and to praise their God. But these three are willing to be martyrs rather than to break God's commandment to worship him alone. And as we have seen, they don't take their rescue for granted. They believe that God can rescue them, but they say, well, even if he doesn't, we'll still worship his holy name. And throughout history, many martyrs have indeed died in the cause of righteousness, but they did so, I believe, in the hope of God's ultimate reward for them. There is a very telling passage towards the end of Hebrews chapter 11, which is often regarded as God's photograph album of the righteous, where he speaks about many Old Testament characters that we know and some that we don't. And I'm going to read to you from Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32 onwards. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel and the prophets, who, through faith, conquered kingdoms, administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they may gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. I find that fascinating because it chronicles some of the awful things that did indeed happen to God's people in these late Old Testament times. Some of the names we recognise, others we don't, some remain anonymous. But there is the sense that even though many of them suffered earthly death as a result of their martyrdom and their persecution, they were being held for a time when, in eternity, they and the Church of Jesus Christ, us, would together be raised to glory and receive a reward from God. And what an encouragement that should be for each one of us, that we will be glorified along with all these saints who've suffered far worse martyrdoms than, by God's grace, we will probably ever have to do. So there is a connection, you see, between these ancient stories with all their hyperbole and the situation of the Church of Jesus Christ today, which in many places is being persecuted and many Christians enduring martyrdom, as well we know, and yet together with the Old Testament saints of God, the New Testament and the current Church's saints of God will receive a reward and a blessing and a glory from God. So let us be encouraged and let's continue to pray for the persecuted church, because this is the persecuted church in the Old Testament, really. So the future will be inherited by them along with us, and there will be no final destruction for them. But as I said, the account deliberately contains a lot of hyperbole to show how ridiculous this royal court really is. Endless lists of officials, endless lists of musicians, and the heat of the furnace, 7 times hotter than usual. You can't actually physically do that. That's just, there is a certain temperature at which things burn, and you can't sort of increase that really. Or certainly they couldn't have done in those days. With nuclear physics, you can certainly tweak things a bit these days, but that is obviously hyperbole. But the point is that it shows the power of God, the steadfastness of his people, and the defeat of Satan. Because ultimately Satan is defeated when we resist the power of temptation, and not just when God rewards us for it. But when the power of temptation is resisted, Satan is defeated. Now, drawing your attention to verses 24 and 25, which is an interesting little insert. Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire, and the king sees 4 men. Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of man. Or son of the gods, I'm sorry, I misread that. The 4th looks like a son of the gods. And then in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Praise be to God who has sent his angel and rescued his servant." Now, there is an awful lot of speculation and argument about the identity of this 4th being that was seen in the furnace along with the 3 men. Nebuchadnezzar thinks he looks like a son of the gods in one breath and as an angel in another breath. Well, I suppose the answer is we don't really know, but an angel is certainly how possibly the Old Testament people of God would have understood it. But reading back into it, some have suggested that this is, and I'm going to use a technical word here and then I will explain it, that it is a Christophany. You know the word epiphany, and that means a showing forth of. Well, a Christophany is a technical word for a showing forth of Christ, and it's used particularly in describing incidents in the Old Testament where there seems to be an appearance of a godlike person in human form, which kind of points forward as the presence of Christ with his people, even before the time of the incarnation, the time of Christmas and the birth of Christ. And
can you spell Christ?
Yes, Christ, Christ, Ophany, Ophany. So it begins with Christ and then the fanny bit like the Epiphany. Okay, so showing forth of Christ. And we can go on a detective trail, and this is something which one of these days I would love to have the time and the leisure really to go into this in detail, to find the appearances of Christ in the Old Testament. I'm sure I could probably find a book where somebody else has done the work for me, but I really like to do these things myself. But the appearance of Christ in the Old Testament is a possible explanation for this 4th figure that was in the furnace, which is a very comforting thought that Christ, the Son of God, even before the incarnation, was ever present with his people. Because, of course, he is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. He didn't suddenly come into being when he was born in Bethlehem. He took on flesh when he was born in Bethlehem. But he was one with the Father from eternity to eternity, all the way around. So that's the interest about this 4th figure, and no explanation is given. We're just the text is there, and we're just encouraged to make of it as we will. But the outcome, of course, of the story is, as in chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar's dream was explained to him by Daniel, that he proclaims that the worship of God is permissible. Verse 29, "Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego be cut to pieces and their houses turned into rubble." Here he is again exercising this ridiculous hyperbolic power and, well, I called it hubris really. But there's an encouragement again for later generations who see brutal regimes trying to stamp out the ancestral worship of the living God. We've seen this in our own lifetimes when countries have been secularized and the worship of God and of Jesus Christ has been banned. But it will never succeed totally. Hopefully this will encourage us too. Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And we really do have to believe that and take that on board, because we see signs of the church diminishing and becoming irrelevant and so on. And yet, as we were saying in the prayer meeting on Wednesday, it's so encouraging to see some of the Gen Z people coming to faith and coming back to church because they are disillusioned by the climate of the present age. And it's a sign that God's church will not be silenced or shut down, and the gates of hell will not have the final word over it. So even in the Old Testament, in these obscure and fantastical stories, that is true. So be encouraged. So really that's probably all I want to say about chapter 3, because it is self-explanatory. It's just a jolly good read and a jolly good story. We will move on to chapter 6, where we have the most obvious and the most famous story of all in the book of Daniel.
Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticise or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible and completely trustworthy. So they concluded our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rule of his religion. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, Long live King Darius. We're all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors and governors, that the king should make a law that would be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law.
Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prays to any god or man except you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, The decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to the king and said to him, Remember, O king, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles. so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep.
At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones.
Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
Thank you. Right, thanks very much. In one sense, there's not an awful lot more to say about this than we've said in other contexts with the previous story, especially as it's such a well-known story. But there are some details that pay for a little bit of scrutiny. It reads more like a parable than a historical account. For example, I think another Old Testament example would be Jonah and the big fish, which we often think of as a whale. It's probably more a parable than an actual piece of history as to what exactly happened. I don't think it's heresy to suggest that this may not be exactly historical, because a lot of the Bible is unashamedly told in stories with a sting in the tail, stories with a meaning. But they're there to teach us a greater truth. I hope I haven't destroyed your innocence by saying this, because I do believe that the Bible is the Word of God, but there are ways and ways of expressing the truth, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in parables, sometimes in allegory, sometimes in sheer plain history. I'm going to read you a little bit from Psalm 57, which I think resonates with some of what we've read here. It's a psalm of David, who was so often being persecuted and chased by the Philistines. And he says, "I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends his love and his faithfulness. I am in the midst of lions. I lie among ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be all over the earth." You see, David is talking about lions there. And even in the next breath, he says, I'm not speaking literally, I'm speaking about men who've got sharp claws and so on, and sharp weapons. Well, there were lions in the Persian Gulf in those days. You may think that the present countries of Iran and Iraq and so on, where many of these stories are set, are not really associated with wild lions, but back in those days they were. And the evidence for that is partly well, there may be quite a lot of evidence for it, but one piece of evidence which I rather enjoy is the fact that there are some wonderful ancient Assyrian artefacts, carvings, many of which are on view, on display in the British Museum, which show some of the kings of Nebuchadnezzar's era, but one particular with a name that I really rather like, Ashurbanipal, having a lion hunt. And this is something, it was the sport of kings in those days, hunting lions. And so there were indigenous lions in that part of the world in those days, because the carvings that you can see at the British Museum and other places are contemporaneous with this history. And in fact, I like the lion hunt of Ashurbanipal so much that I managed to source on the internet 3 plaques, facsimiles of it, which I've got hanging on an outside wall in my garden. Just because of my nerdy love of Old Testament history. So, yes, the presence of lions is a very real possibility, but the story of the lion's den, I think, has perhaps been just a little bit over-embellished, if I might say so. But it's what it means that's important. We start this chapter with the reign of King Darius. We've actually skipped a generation, skipped a monarchy here, and we will go back, as I said, to chapters 4 and 5 in our next session. But I wanted to take these stories together because they're so parallel. But this is the time of the Median Empire. If you cast your mind back to the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had of the statue with the head of gold, and the shoulders and the chest of silver, and the belly of bronze, and the feet, the legs and the feet of iron and clay, you will remember that the Second Empire, the silver and of arms and chest, referred to the Median Empire, the empire of the Medes, and the first king of that empire when it came to world domination is Darius. And so this is the one that we meet here. And he seems to have been very much a chip off the old block as far as his attitude was concerned, because he's just as full of hubris as his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. He and his officials want him to be the one that is revered and worshipped. Kings and monarchs were like gods, as were the Roman emperors indeed at the time of Jesus, were worshipped as gods, and that's who they thought they were. So the second stage of the statue, but Daniel still got a top job in this new administration. He had been distinguished amongst all the administrators by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And of course jealousy soon comes in. What's this foreigner doing in charge of our country? So all the satraps and the leaders and the rulers, the administrators, decide to trump up some charges, just like the Pharisees did against the Lord Jesus. There's nothing new under the sun, really, is there? To try and trap Daniel and to bring him down so that they could have what they thought were their rightful places. So they thought up this ridiculous plot and got the king just to sign it. Just another document. I've signed this, Your Majesty. And this was this edict that anybody who worships anybody else other than the king would be put to death. And it shows how unthinking these monarchs were. Again, another very, very parallel story from the Old Testament, which you may be familiar with, is the story of Esther, the book of Esther, where King Xerxes is encouraged by his creepy crawly head of state Haman to sign a document which actually calls for the annihilation of the Jews. And Xerxes didn't have a clue what he was signing. Oh yes, another document, let's have another drink. You know, that was how it was, these courts that were just so ridiculously lavish. And so Darius, who certainly was very happy to get on with it, just signed the document, didn't think anything more about it, and didn't realise that he was condemning his favourite, Daniel, to persecution and to almost certain death. Daniel realised that this was a plot angled against him. There's no doubt about it. Verse 10, Daniel learned that this decree had been published, so what did he do? Did he hide his faith? Did he just shout help and run away? No, he didn't. He continued to follow the habit of a lifetime, and he prayed towards Jerusalem, towards the east, 3 times a day, and he didn't draw the curtains so that nobody could see him. He did what he had always done, and he remained perfectly loyal and faithful to his God. And again, I think this is such a lesson for us, because we have it pretty easy, but we can still get so slipshod about prayer. Well, I know I do, and I'm sure most of us would admit that, we don't pray as much as we should. It has been said that a Christian on their deathbed is more likely to say, I wish I'd prayed more, than I wish I'd spent more time in the office. So Daniel continued to be a man of prayer, and he prayed to God rather than to the king, whatever the consequences. But the king couldn't be seen to be losing faith, even though he tried to find a loophole to save Daniel. And so he is miserable. Verse 14, when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort to save him until sundown. He realised too late what he'd done. He'd fallen into his own trap, really. But like his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, it's very interesting that he realised potentially the power of Daniel's God. Because Daniel was put in this den of lions overnight. He was sealed with a seal. The stone was put over the entrance to the cave. And then at the first light of dawn, verse 19, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den, and he called out to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has God been able to rescue you? I mean, humanly speaking, he'd have been mincemeat within moments. But Darius still thinks that perhaps there's just an outside chance that maybe this brilliant God that Daniel's always going on about might just about have had enough, just a teensy-weensy bit of power to save him. It's such a wonderful outcome. And of course, we being on the other side of the story say, yes, of course he has. But in the context of what had happened, it's extraordinary that Darius should even have thought that it might be remotely possible that God could have saved Daniel from these ravening, hungry lions. But of course, we know he did. And so the outcome, well, the fascinating... I'm going off-piste here. Like his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, he's aware of the power of Daniel's God. But he exercises the most horrible retribution against Daniel's accusers, because at the king's command, the men who'd falsely accused him were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And this is the most horrible retribution against the people who played this trick. And it's presented to us not as, this was a good thing, because it wasn't. I mean, of course that slaughter was completely unnecessary, but it's showing us that this king did have immense and terrifying power. It's not God's justice, but it's the king's own selfish, ambitious hubris again. But in verse 25, he does what Nebuchadnezzar had done, and he writes this decree to say, I decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. And then there's this little bit in verse 26 and 27, which is a wonderful hymn of praise to God, if only Darius had really meant it from his heart. He is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion will never end. It reads like one of the Psalms, doesn't it? And yet we know how false these kings really were. So the king appears to accept the power of God and to endorse a command to worship him. And what he says is true about God, and it would have been a source of hope to people in the regimes of persecution. But we know that God can and does win hearts and minds over to his will. And so Daniel lives to fight another day. He's been spared to continue his mission. And we're told in verse 28, Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. I think we noted previously that Cyrus was mentioned as the king who was reigning at during the end of Daniel's long career as a prophet. And Cyrus, of course, is a very significant Old Testament character, because although he's a pagan king, he was used by God to repatriate God's people from exile back to Judah and Jerusalem once again. And Cyrus is actually called, in the later chapters of the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is called my servant by God. Even though there's no suggestion that he ever came to faith in the living God, he was still a tool in God's hand, which reminds us that God can use anyone he chooses, really, to perform his will. Even if their hearts are not right with him, he can use them as, well, one might say a pawn in his game, but that makes God sound like a heartless puppeteer, which he is not. But he can use all kinds and conditions of people, and I believe that he does in order to get his will done. He doesn't pull our strings, but he knows what we're going to do, and he accommodates sometimes the sin, but often the righteousness of people to achieve his will here on earth. So I think of these two stories of, first of all, Daniel's friends enduring the fiery furnace, and then Daniel himself enduring the lion's den, as proof of God's sovereignty, God's power, God's faithfulness, and the ultimate victory of God over human institutions which seem at the time so powerful, so big, so terrifying, so worrying. And I'm sure we're all worried about lots of things that are going on in the world today. But may I remind you that our God is still the same God who rescued his people of old, and who will rescue a people for himself and grant us crowns of glory. God bless you.